founder of Alliance Strategic Advisors as well, and he's been bringing deep insights into global security, diplomacy, as well as strategic affairs. Dr. Tharoor, if I may request you to kindly join our guest on stage and proceed with the session we have been waiting for. Can we have a round of applause, please, to two very articulate men, and we look forward to this session. Over to you, sir.
I was just telling the organizers, this must be the most peculiar case of programming ever done, with Ambassador Volker and I coming right in between two music sessions. But however, let's turn to the music of the world. Please be comfortable. Okay. And, these chairs are far too low for anyone's good. Anyway, great to see you all, and we're here with Ambassador Volker, who will begin with a few general remarks, I understand, which you're welcome to deliver from the podium or right here if you wish.
I can stand up and,
sure,
and deliver them from here, but thank you so much. And I think it is a little bit poetic, though, as you say, that that was just such a wonderful performance, absolutely stunning. And I think the only thing between you and the cocktail hour is us.
That's right.
So yet again, geopolitics is going to bring you down. I do want to thank the organizers. I want to thank ABP, because this has really been a phenomenal experience, a phenomenal day. I have learned so much being here and listening to some of these speakers today. And I also have to say, it is great to be in an environment where there is such positive energy. It really is inspiring, and it really gives you a lot of hope for the future. We're talking about new frontiers. And that's the theme of here, and I really do think we're on a new frontier in geopolitics. I think there are two things happening that pull in different directions. One of them is technology is changing geopolitics incredibly quickly. It is leveling the playing field. It is spreading economic wealth and opportunity. It is diminishing the impact of the big high-tech weapon systems for smaller ones, and it is creating a generation of people who are not tied to the legacies of the past in the way that previous generations were. It is a generation of people through technology are accessing the world and looking forward. So it is a very interesting transformation. But at the same time that that's happening, you have people throughout the world who are feeling dislocated by this technology, by this change, by how societies are changing. And those people feeling dislocated are often trying to react against it. And they're emphasizing national differences, religious differences, cultural differences, historical differences, grievances of all kinds. And that is creating the potential for conflict. And then third, you have, again, some great powers that are seizing on these opportunities of disaffected populations in order to try to extend their power. And we see this, for example, in the case of China, or in the case of Iran, or in the case of Russia. So it is creating a lot of turmoil in geopolitics right now. I thought I would quickly answer three questions, and we'll talk about this with Dr. Tharoor in greater depth. But first off, what's happening with Trump and in the United States? And here, I think it is truly a case of that feeling of disenfranchisement which Donald Trump has capitalized on to try to bring a sense of order back to the American people who are feeling dislocated. In 2017, when he was taking office as president for the first time, it was after 2 terms of Barack Obama and 2 terms of George W. Bush, and the people of the country were feeling that we were overextended. We were doing too much, and Trump wanted to bring it back and focus on America first. So America first in 2017 meant pulling back. In 2025, as he takes office, it's after 1 term of President Biden when we've seen wars break out in Europe, wars in the Middle East, globalization continuing apace, people feeling disenfranchised, people feeling afraid, and the perception of declining American power, declining or increasing weakness of the United States contributing to this. And particularly the collapse of Afghanistan, I think, cemented that image in people's minds. So in 2025, as President Trump comes to office, he's looking at America first as meaning rebuilding American strength. And in contrast to what looked like isolationism 8 years ago, you now see a very, very assertive foreign policy from President Trump now, talking about things like acquiring Greenland, taking over the Panama Canal, acting swiftly to try to bring an end to the war in Ukraine, an end to the wars in the Middle East, and wanting to refocus America on China, using tariffs very aggressively to try to rebalance global trade. It is a very assertive foreign policy. The second thing is that he is leading what I would call a cultural counter-revolution in the United States. There's a perception that the trends of progressivism and wokeism went too far, and they alienated a majority of the people. A smaller minority was happy, but a majority unhappy, and Trump is taking advantage of that for political reasons, but is then also working to try to change that cultural trend in society. And then finally, he is trying to go after what he believes to be an inherently biased deep state, biased against the majority of these disenfranchised people in the country in favor of a more liberal agenda. And so he is aggressively attacking the federal institutions to reduce the size, reduce the budget, reduce any political bias, and reorient them. This is causing tremendous anxiety and upheaval in the U.S. and the world. And that is how he is going about things now. I'm going to pause there so that we get into a conversation. But I do want to talk more about what's happening with the war of Russia against Ukraine, and then also a bit about what all of this means for India. So, Dr. Tharoor.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Volker. Really appreciate that. And I think the question that's uppermost in all of our minds has really been the unpredictability of President Trump. You mentioned a few examples already. His dramatic announcement that he wanted to take over Greenland, that he wanted to retake over the Panama Canal, which half a century ago had been given to the Panamanians, that he wanted Canada to become the 51st state. And he was even greeting the Prime Minister of Canada as a governor of the 51st state. He wants to redevelop Gaza into some sort of Middle Eastern Riviera. He has pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accord, out of WHO, out of the UN Human Rights Council, he's wound up USAID rather. I mean, there's all sorts of things happening. And I think the first question is there a method to all this madness? I must say you gave a fairly rational account of the logic behind some of his approaches, but it strikes many of us that there's a sort of almost coruscating series of amazing statements and initiatives which don't necessarily do much except throw the entire world off kilter and off balance.
Yeah. Well, as you said, I think for Donald Trump, unpredictability is a deliberate tactic. Mm-hmm. He wants to create uncertainty because then that makes people react to him.
Yep.
He also likes to be provocative. He likes to say shocking things in order to get people to react to that. Like you mentioned, turning Gaza into a beautiful Mediterranean resort. Very shocking for everybody in the world.
Especially Palestinians,
who may or may not get to live there. and I think the reason he did that is because he wanted to highlight a two-state solution is not going to happen. A one-state solution is not going to happen, and nobody is coming up with any other ideas. It's just conflict. So he put out, I'll give you an idea, I'll take it over, and I'll build a resort. And then that is now prompting others to try to think, well, what is a realistic alternative to those two scenarios that we've had for so long and that are not working? So that's one side of things, unpredictability and provocation. But the other thing, and I think a guiding principle for Trump, if you could call it a principle, is his perception that the U.S. has been doing too much in the world and therefore being taken advantage of. It's not being treated fairly. For example, Europe had tariffs on American automobiles of 10% when America had tariffs on European automobiles of 2.5%. And so he is determined to institute reciprocity, make it a level playing field, because he thinks that we've been treated unfairly. Currently,
But even the attitude that allies are freeloaders when it comes to defense.
Exactly.
I mean, that's a pretty serious...
It is a serious allegation, and he looks at the numbers and says, you have 500 million people in Europe, you have 300 and some million in the United States, but when you look at defense spending of NATO countries, the U.S. is accounting for about 70% of the defense spending of NATO countries, and the others are accounting for about 30%. So we are doing more than our share. That's his perception. And he doesn't view the value that allies provide, even just by territory stability, market economies. He views it as we're paying and they're benefiting. So he's trying to rewrite this.
So that's consistent, because he made that point in his first term as well. But what seems different about the second term is that he appears to have dispensed with the conventional assumptions of the post-World War II liberal international order. The sense that there is a predictable set of rules that all countries abide by, sovereignties of states, inviolability of borders, non-resort to the use of force. His sudden and unexpected announcement that he will talk to the Russians and Saudi Arabia without either consulting the Europeans first or even taking Ukraine into confidence, that's shaken things up, because in effect he's legitimizing a blatant violation of the UN Charter. Do none of these things matter anymore to the Trump administration? Does the entire set of principles and assumptions we associate with the liberal international order suddenly cease to matter?
I wouldn't go that far. I think what he's trying to do is say that that order as it operated disadvantaged the United States, and we're going to push back, tariffs as an example on that. But when you take the meeting in Saudi Arabia, I was the U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine in 2017 to 2019. The methodology that we used, and also under President Obama, we had lots of diplomatic meetings. We met with the French and Germans, we met with the Ukrainians, we met at NATO, we met at the EU, we met with the Russians, and all of these took place. We all talked to each other, but it was a lot of activity, not one table where everybody's there at the same time. That's what he's doing again. And Trump's position on this is that for the past 3 years, we've been supporting Ukraine to defend itself against Russia, but no one's trying to end the war. If you want to end the war, you have to get Russia to stop. And that's what he is now trying to turn his attention to. Now he sees two sides to this. He wants to push on Russia, and he wants to entice Russia. So a push and a pull. And on Ukraine, he wants to make sure that the U.S. is paid back for the assistance provided. The U.S. has provided about $100 billion worth of assistance, military and financial, which is coming straight from U.S. taxpayers. And so he wants to recoup that, and that's why he's now pushing this idea of a deal with Ukraine on shared benefit from Ukraine's natural resources, so that Ukraine can pay the U.S. back and also continue to access military support and build itself up, but do it on a paid-for basis rather than a charity basis. That's his position.
But that's pretty devastating, because Ukraine has suffered colossal human and financial losses, as well as not
exactly
just lives
right.
lost, but people migrating out of their country. And now on top of that, you want to take away half their rare earths and God knows what other mineral resources they have. That seems pretty crass.
I agree with you. I agree with you. But I think if you flip it around the other way, you have substantial wealth in the ground in Ukraine, some of it on territory occupied by Russia,
yeah.
some of it on territory that Ukraine controls but can't be developed as long as there's a war going on. And so as much value as there is there, it has very little present value. And in fact, if Ukraine is defeated, it has none. So this is a way to leverage that value, create sustainable political and economic support for Ukraine so that it can survive, prosper, and move into the future. That's the way Trump is thinking about this. And a characteristic of him, we mentioned that he thinks of U.S. being treated unfairly. Another characteristic is he is always transactional. He wants to know what the deal is.
What's in it for me?
What's in it for me?
But I'm going to push back a little further on this, because he's also been pretty unkind about the Ukrainian president, Zelensky. Called him a sort of mediocre comedian, said he's down to 4% in the approval ratings, which is actually not accurate. He's scoring between 42 and 57% in different polls. But he's essentially disparaging Zelensky, it seems, as a means of saying this guy isn't worth standing up for. Let's get the Russians to back off and finish this war. Now, is this something that you see as part of a calibrated strategy towards Russia going beyond the Ukraine war? What are the implications if Ukraine ends up losing territory that was seized in military conquest?
I think for Trump it's a tactic, and it's also an emotional response. From the tactical side, he's trying to make sure that Zelensky is prepared to end the war now, even though he doesn't get all his territory back now. Zelensky's talked about this, saying we'll try to get it back by other means, we're not going to get it militarily. Trump is putting pressure on Putin to end the war, but he's got to make sure that Zelensky is ready to do that too. So he views that as pressure. Second, because he's doing this, he has put so much emphasis on ending the war, Zelensky has pushed back quite understandably on some of the things that President Trump has said or done. And this is something to which Trump has responded emotionally, saying, basically feeling you're getting in the way of my effort to end the war. So every time someone criticizes Donald Trump, his tactic is to double down and criticize even more.
You know, the thing is, though, that at the UN we always used to have this belief that there is such a thing as ripeness for war, the two sides being prepared to make peace. Now, for the longest time we had the impression that both sides kept feeling they could gain on the battlefield. For the first time, there seems to be an environment where both sides might be willing to talk. By essentially giving away to the Russians what they could have won on the negotiating table, isn't America putting Ukraine in an impossible position? I ask you as somebody who knows both countries intimately well, and I'm holding no brief for anyone here. I'm just curious as an outside observer when Secretary of Defense Hegseth just says, well, Ukrainians can't hold on to the territory, end of that. You know, isn't that a negotiating point? Isn't that something that you want to actually come out of the process rather than give it away before you even sat down?
Well, on that particular point, no. Because you don't want to be discussing Ukraine's NATO membership with Russia. It's none of their business.
Okay.
So it's something for Ukraine and NATO to figure out at some point, not part of a negotiation. That's why I didn't react negatively to Hegseth's comment. However, the media and others, and I was in Europe most of last week, they reacted it as taking it off the table, meaning they'll never have NATO. And then Vice President Vance had to come out later and correct that and say, no, that's not what we're saying. All options are on the table. So it's confused messages in the first few weeks of the administration. And frankly, you only have one decision maker, which is Donald Trump. He's the one who is calling the shots. And Trump is in a hurry. Trump wants to get this stopped, a ceasefire in place as quickly as possible. And I think his framework is not fleshed out, no more detail than this. It is have a ceasefire, deter future Russian attacks, and get the Europeans to pick up most of the burden.
The burden of the reconstruction.
The burden of preventing future attacks, deterrence.
So a defense force from the Europeans.
Yeah, a defense force, security assurances. It doesn't mean the U.S. would not participate, particularly if it's over the horizon or if it's enabling support, intelligence, reconnaissance, and so on.
But no troops on the ground.
No troops on the ground, and wanting the Europeans to do most of this.
So is this how you would see this evolving in the next few weeks? A ceasefire pretty soon and an outline settlement which would leave Russia in possession of what it's got, Ukraine in possession of what it's got, which is a good deal less than the official territory they had before the war, and then a European peacekeeping force on Ukrainian soil. Would that broadly be the elements in the next few weeks?
I think that's largely right. I would think even probably in the coming week you're going to see a deal with Ukraine and the U.S. on shared exploitation of natural resources to pay for all this. I then think you will see a ceasefire fairly quickly because now the U.S. will have a vested interest in protecting this and making sure that the war is over and allowing the economic redevelopment to begin. It'll be pressure on the Europeans to put in a deterrent force and to help strengthen Ukraine, training, equipping, financing, military forces. And then I think you're going to see a rapid push on economic redevelopment rather than warfare. Now, one thing I have to say, and it's very important in this audience too, Russia, and Vladimir Putin in particular, has never abandoned the notion that Russia is an empire with the right to take over and rule over other people. British gave this up, French gave this up, Americans gave this up. The Russians have never given that up. So Vladimir Putin has attacked Georgia, attacked Ukraine, occupies part of Moldova, and is not done. So what is very important here is that we make this pivot successfully from a ceasefire to deterring further aggression. We can't allow that to happen. And we have to know that he will intend further aggression. He will use the ceasefire to rearm, rebuild, plan further aggression. And we have to use that time better than he does.
And is it your assumption that the Europeans will go along with such an approach? There isn't a constituency in Europe to continue the fight without American support and help the Ukrainians to keep fighting the Russians?
It's very interesting. So in the days after the Munich Security Conference last week, French President Macron convened 2 summits of European leaders, one of more Northern and West Europe, one of Central and Eastern Europe, for the very purpose of trying to flesh out what is it that we Europeans can do with or without the United States so that we are able to play that role. In my mind, it's a shame that they're doing it for the wrong reasons. They're being provoked by Donald Trump of perhaps being abandoned, but they're doing the right thing for the wrong reasons if they can finally get it done. Next week, you're going to have the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and French President Macron in Washington, D.C., and I think this will be the first serious conversations with them about Europe's capability and willingness to take this on and what is required in terms of support from the United States.
Okay, well, we've covered a lot of ground there, but we don't have a lot of time, and I'd like to move you all the way over to our continent here. China. In the first term, Trump was pretty belligerent about China. There was even a trade war that the US led against China. There seems to be a very different kind of atmosphere towards China now, with Mr. Musk's voice being pretty prominent in the administration. There seems to be a willingness to consider a trade deal with China, maybe more than a trade deal. And we in India are watching this with some curiosity as well as some concern, because we haven't had the best of years, the best of experiences with China in the last few years. How do you read the Trump administration's attitude to China in the foreseeable future?
Yeah, well, first off, I would remind everyone here that when Trump took office in 2017, the prevailing wisdom in Washington, D.C. was that China can become a responsible stakeholder in a global economy. That assumption was way out of date. We had seen for years that China has an assertive or aggressive mentality with respect to the global liberal order, with respect to trade, with respect to its neighborhood. And so Trump changed that and really built a bipartisan consensus in Washington that we have to prepare for a situation where China is a rival, a competitor, and potentially an adversary. And so he did that. We are in that situation now, including after the term of President Biden, where Biden did not change that policy. And I think Trump is looking to see where we can avoid conflict with China, but it doesn't change the understanding that this is the kind of China we're dealing with. The contrast is with India. So you look at China as a rising power, economically, politically, militarily, technologically, but one that is a direct adversary of the United States. You look at India, which is a rising power, economically, politically, technologically, but is a friendly country, one that we feel that we share a certain set of values with, that is a democracy, that has the opportunity of being a very strong partner with the United States. President Trump also personally likes Prime Minister Modi. That doesn't stop the transactionalism that Donald Trump has. He'll still look at transactions. He'll still look at tariffs and leveling those off. But I think there is a more positive attitude towards India and a more wary attitude towards China. And the reason for this lack of a trade war is to see whether we can avoid that degree of confrontation. I fully expect that if China does not change its own behavior towards the United States and U.S. businesses in China, that you are going to come back to this issue of tariffs in order to try to pressure Chinese behavior.
But I mean, you are conscious that, you know, the question will be asked, let's put it that way, not by me necessarily, that if Trump can sell Ukraine down the river, why can't he sell Taiwan down the river to China tomorrow? Is there a possibility the U.S. will back off and say this relationship? You remember the days when Hillary Clinton was musing aloud about a G2 running the world of the U.S. and China, and the rest of us said, hey, that's a very bad idea. You know, we don't really like you thinking that way. Is there any risk of us getting back on the G2 kind of plan?
I view them as two separate issues. G2, I don't see. I think that there are so many different interests between the U.S. and China, most of them competing. I don't see us collaborating in that way as a G2. And in fact, there are so many other players and other interests around that that doesn't strike me as emerging. You can talk about G2 in terms of size, but not in terms of coordination and cooperation.
Good to hear that from our point of view.
As for Taiwan, however, I think we are still in an unclear situation as to what lesson does China learn from Russia's war on Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
If things go the way we just talked about, there's a partnership, a strategic partnership with the U.S. and Ukraine surrounding natural resources. The war is stopped. Putin does not succeed in his objectives of eliminating Ukraine, taking all of its territory, imposing his own government. Ukraine is a sovereign, independent state and is accelerating its track towards joining the European Union and has security assurances from the rest of Europe, including a West European troop presence in Ukraine. If that happens, and we haven't seen it yet, if that happens, that will send a signal to China that this didn't go very well for Russia. Russia did not get what it wanted out of this. And so what did we learn? Russia's aggression weakened Russia, failed to achieve its objectives, unified the West, and cemented Ukraine's status. That is not what they want to do with Taiwan and with the West there. So it would send a salutary message to China. If we get this wrong, however, and we could still get this wrong, Trump is seen as having sold out. Putin is seen as victorious. If that were to happen, I think that would be an encouragement to China and a signal to China that we wouldn't have the stomach to help Taiwan.
So it could go either way, which is slightly worrying. Let's turn back to the US-India equation. Some of us have had the impression that we are now way beyond something that can be that can have any setbacks, that there is not only an extremely compatible relationship, the reasons you mentioned, democracy, no real areas of disagreement on the world, etc. There's also a very strong Indian-American population, 4 million, which is disproportionately influential. They have the largest single median income of any ethnic group in the United States, including white Americans and Japanese Americans. Indian Americans top the list. On top of that, they're influential in politics, in elected office, in campaigning, in campaign staff, in Capitol Hill staff. You've got Indians all over the place, and they are therefore bound to have a constructive effect on American policy. Is that too naive here? I mean, is that by and large? I mean, is this something? Can the U.S. once again turn less than friendly or more indifferent towards Indian interests?
Of course, in the world of geopolitics, anything is possible, and it would depend upon issues that arise that we don't see in front of us today. But it would be a diversion from what looks to be the natural path, which is growing relationships, growing closeness between the U.S. and India. And I would add to the list that you gave The CEOs of many
Fortune
major
500
companies are Indian American, very well known and very well respected. Think about the political parties. You have Kamala Harris, Tamil American on the Democratic side. You have Vivek Ramaswamy, one of Trump's favorites on the Trumpist side. And on the traditional Republicans, you have Nikki Haley.
That's right.
So you're covered.
So that's one of precisely that list would make me feel very encouraged. And amongst the Trump administration appointees, you now have the new Surgeon General, you have the head of the National Institutes of Health, you have the head of the FBI,
Exactly.
you have a Hindu American, though not an Indian American, as the Director of National Intelligence. You have the former co-chair of the India Caucus as your national security advisor. There's a tremendous Indian voice, influence, consciousness possible in the highest echelons of the Trump administration.
There is, but, and I would just caution, you're right, but I would caution, no one should assume that all Indians think alike.
Of course they don't. We don't here in this country, so why should we in America, right? But, I mean, we're running out of time. There's one question everyone's very curious about. You served in the first Trump administration from 2017 to 19. Did you have many opportunities to have, to be in the same room as Mr. Trump? What was that like? Is he hands-on? Is he abstracted? Is he, what's he like to work with?
So I had 4 different occasions when I was engaging with President Trump. He is always multitasking. He is always highly energetic. I've never seen him not fully on. He is always in project mode. He knows the answer already, and he is telling people what it is. And it's very, very hard to bring up new information, to argue a different point. But it's essential that if you want to make a different point, you stand your ground and argue. If you don't do that, he dismisses you completely. If you argue, he may shout you down or argue down, but you're getting your point across. And in a few different instances, I think we managed to move policy with his support based on making a strong argument. The example that comes to my mind is giving Ukraine anti-tank systems in 2017. You may remember that President Obama, together with Chancellor Merkel of Germany, had an arms embargo on Ukraine, wouldn't give them any weapons. And we believed it was essential, given that Russia had all the weapons, that we give them defensive weapons in case Russia attacks again, which of course they did. And President Trump's question was not, are they lethal or not lethal? His question was, are they going to pay us back? And we said, no, that's not the way foreign military assistance works. However, think of it as a starter kit. We'll give them the first batch, the first 200 missiles, and then they can buy more. And he liked that, and so we went ahead and did it.
Well, it looks like he might be doing that with our country as well. Thank you, Ambassador Volker. I must say that there used to be a little more than half a century ago, during the administration of President Richard Nixon, something called the madman theory of international relations. You must remember that. When apparently President Nixon had this idea that if you convince your adversaries that you're irrational, that you're capable of doing really bizarre things, they will be scared to provoke you for fear that you might do something so totally irrational that the world could blow up. And as a result, apparently he was convinced that as long as he stayed slightly unpredictable, and he was, by comparison with President Trump, a very modest, straightforward, predictable guy, that he'd be all right. I'm just wondering whether we might actually be seeing the madman theory of international relations being played out in Washington, D.C. these days.
I am quite sure that's what we're seeing. That's absolutely what it is. As we said at the opening, he uses unpredictability and uncertainty as a device to get people to react to him and to what he wants them to do. And I think that he has the ambition of settling issues and moving on. Wants to end the war in Ukraine, end the war in the Middle East, balance trade, focus on future competition with China, rebuild and strengthen the American economy. That's what he wants to do. And to do that, he is using all kinds of tools, including threats and unpredictability and insults, to shake everything up to try to push it his way.
Okay, I think since the witching hour is almost upon us, I can see shadows lurking. One last question. Yesterday or today, Senator Michael of Utah introduced a bill to withdraw the United States from the United Nations altogether, kick the UN out of New York, and shut down US participation. Is that to be taken seriously, or is this just something out of not left field but right field that we can ignore?
Yeah, it depends how you mean take it seriously. I doubt that such legislation would ever be passed by Congress, especially in the Senate. You're going to need, at least 7 Democrats and all Republicans to vote to bring it to a vote. I don't see that happening. But take it seriously because it is reflecting a widespread belief in the United States that the UN is not effective, at least at the Security Council level. It's not effective and very, very expensive. So there is that frustration. So when I say take it seriously, we all ought to be thinking about how do we make the UN more effective and more efficient.
Fair enough. All right. Well, Ambassador Kurt Volker, thank you very much. We've covered a lot of ground in half an hour. Thank you for your presence here. Wish you all the very best on your onward travel.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tharoor, for conducting this session in a way only you can. Thank you so much, and thank you, Ambassador Volker. I think your insights today have given us an inside track into how President Trump is thinking, especially about Ukraine. Thank you for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, if I can now request Sumanto Datta, CEO, ABP Network, to join us on stage to felicitate our guest, and also Sam Balsara, founder and chairman and MD of Madison World. Please join us on stage, sir. Yes, absolutely. Audience, time to give a huge round of applause to Ambassador Volker for being here with us on the Ideas of India platform. Thank you to our presenters, and once again, our thanks to Dr. Tharoor. बहुत-बहुत धन्यवाद. And ladies and gentlemen, a question you have to ask yourself tonight is, how many times have you seen a 3-time Grammy winner perform for you? How many times? We only have one lucky person. The rest of you should